Now, as a lot of you know, today is the 40th anniversary of the release of The Empire Strikes Back, the Star Wars film that nowadays is regarded by most fans and critics alike as not only the best Star Wars film, but also a masterpiece of cinema in its own right, though supposedly that hasn't always been the case. It hasn't always been held in such high regard. And at least to some degree that is true. In fact, I often hear it brought up, and this usually comes up when someone is talking about or trying to defend The Last Jedi. Anyway, I often hear it brought up how divisive The Empire Strikes Back was when it first came out, that reactions to it were mixed at best. And they'll point to all these unflattering or negative critical reviews from the time, and there are plenty of them out there, and follow that up with completely unfounded claims at worst and anecdotal evidence at best, that a lot of people at the time really didn't like the film, and would only come to like and or appreciate it later on. They then come to the conclusion that 40 years from now, or sooner, we'll all agree in hindsight that The Last Jedi was actually a masterpiece. But of course the problem with this argument or conclusion is that the situation with The Last Jedi is the complete opposite in almost every way to what it was with The Empire Strikes Back. Because whereas the consensus from critics back then about Empire seemed to range from it being not quite as good as the first Star Wars movie to it just being bad and completely missing the mark, the consensus from critics today is overwhelmingly positive towards The Last Jedi. And then when we move to how fans initially felt about these two movies, or just general audience reaction, well, oddly enough, the same people who will tell you it's only a very small and loud vocal minority today that dislikes The Last Jedi, despite living in the age of the internet where evidence to the contrary can be presented, and even quantified to some degree, they'll try to simply claim that a lot of people, implying the majority or near it I'd imagine, didn't like The Empire Strikes Back when it first came out, based largely on the recollection, or some anecdotal accounts, of fans from 40 years ago. And look, I'll be honest here, I personally have no idea how fans originally reacted to The Empire Strikes Back. I was too young at the time to remember that film when it came out. I'm just happy I can remember seeing Return of the Jedi in the theater when I was a kid. Either way, we simply cannot even begin to come to a consensus about how fans actually felt about it back then. Even if we conducted some sort of massive survey, we're asking people to remember how they first felt about a movie they saw 40 years ago, and then to perhaps give their general impressions of how others around them felt about it. And even if we somehow pulled that off, let's keep in mind we can't even begin to agree on what the fan consensus, if there even is one, is for The Last Jedi, despite having infinitely more data to work with, including a very large amount of personal first-hand reviews littering the internet, reviews that were given almost immediately after watching the film the first time. So what would make us think that doing perhaps a massive poll 40 years after the fact would yield accurate or agreed upon results? Yet even without doing that much, or in any other way attempting to gather a good amount of reliable data, some are willing to make very definitive claims about what the fan consensus was from 40 years ago, when virtually no fans actually recorded their first impressions, outside of in perhaps some fan club newsletters that may still exist from the time. But again, if we can't draw conclusions from the abundant amount of reliable data we have today, how could we ever begin to draw conclusions from so little evidence back then? And another very important thing to keep in mind here is how the media always tries to control the narrative. Just look at how the different films in the sequel trilogy got treated by critics and the media, especially the previous two, and at how the fans of them, and especially the detractors, got portrayed. With The Last Jedi, again a film critics loved, which is the opposite of The Empire Strikes Back, the detractors of that film are just a loud, whiny minority, and in some cases called much worse, essentially because they disagree with the critics and their intellectually superior opinions of films. Flat out, to them it's the idiots who don't like the movie. With The Rise of Skywalker, however, it's the opposite. Most critics didn't seem to like it so much, so to them it's the idiots who do like that film. And in both cases, the critics elevate their opinions or reviews of these films. They do all they can, even unknowingly or unwittingly, to control the narrative and make themselves sound correct. And so isn't it possible that back in 1980 and in the years that followed, that something similar, to some extent, probably to a lesser one, could have happened with The Empire Strikes Back? That the apparent critical consensus that that movie was not very good became the believed or accepted norm. That of course most people agreed with the critics about that movie. And no, I'm not going to claim that's absolutely the case. It's merely a question I pose to be pondered over. nor does it answer one very curious question here, which is when and why exactly did critical opinions of The Empire Strikes Back change? Even some of the critics who panned the film then seem to praise it now. So what happened? What made them change their mind? Could it be, and this is just a theory or possibility again, that overwhelming love of the film from the fans or general audience made them actually change their minds or take a second look at it? Now that's doubtful, but something happened to turn once mixed and slightly skewed to the negative critical opinions to extremely positive. Perhaps it just took a great deal of reflection to see its brilliance. Which is what some will say of the haters of The Last Jedi, that given enough time and reflection, those who didn't like it now will begin to see its brilliance, which is, I guess, possible if you believe that anything is possible. However, I find it highly unlikely that many who dislike that film now will change their mind about it given enough time, and vice versa. I doubt many who like it now will grow to dislike it down the road. Now, some may want to point to what seems to be growing acceptance of the prequels within the fanbase as time goes by, and especially as of late, though to some extent the growing acceptance of the prequels seems to come from people who thought at least they were better than the sequels. I think more so, though, it has to do with the changing or expanding makeup of the fanbase. Everyone who was a kid when the prequels came out, who grew up with them and loved them, is now an adult, is now another voice within the fanbase. And so for the sake of argument, I don't think this is the actual number, but for the sake of argument, let's say that half of the original trilogy fans just didn't like the prequels. Well, that half has now become a minority, drowned out to some degree, a large degree, by all the adult prequel fans we have now. And though I do think that to some degree, people who didn't like the prequels have come around to them, and others have either left the fan base or just aren't that vocal anymore, just don't want to keep railing against them, I think the bigger factor is the changing dynamic. The inclusion of all these adult prequel fans. And all this then leads to the question, how will The Last Jedi be viewed in 40 years? And well, who can say for sure, because as I've hopefully been pointing out here, there are so many variables at play, not the least of which will be the relevancy of Star Wars at that time. Will it still be popular or even a thing at that point? And a lot of that depends on just how into Star Wars this current generation is. If the sequels have indeed created a new generation of die-hard fans, like the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy did. And if they didn't, if kids of this generation either didn't get into Star Wars at all, or don't, or ultimately get into it more so because of another trilogy yet to come, or shows like The Mandalorian, or who knows what else may still be coming, because, for example, there are a lot of fans of Star Wars because of something like the Clone Wars, and they are now coming of age and adding their voices to the fandom as well. Anyway, my point is a lot will have to do with the new fans, assuming they're out there and were created. Will they, in the years to come, rise up and show their love for the sequels and sort of drown out some of the hate for them, similar to how prequel fans now drowned out some of the hate for those films? And if that is what happens, if sequel detractors in the years to come stop talking about these films, if they let their hatred subside a bit, and if young sequel fans become adults and start praising those films, it doesn't mean opinions on The Last Jedi ever actually changed. Not to mention, if we are talking 40 years from now, well, a lot of original trilogy fans won't be around anymore, and I dare say they are the ones who dislike the sequels the most, though plenty of those who grew up with the prequels aren't fans either, don't get me wrong, in large part because they feel like their trilogy was ignored by Disney. It also helps that the critical and mainstream narrative going forward is, again, going to be that the movie was fantastic, and only a very small, angry minority didn't like it. Only some outliers cried about it and tried to ruin it for everyone. And so my point here is that if 40 years from now The Last Jedi is considered some sort of masterpiece within the fanbase, at least there's a good chance I won't be around to have to see it. But seriously, as I always say, if you like The Last Jedi, that's great. If you don't, that's also fine. And if you feel like either attacking or defending it, go for it, though hopefully you do it in a civilized manner. And sure, when we take everything into account, there's a good chance that even 10 to 15 years from now, assuming there is a generation of young fans who love the sequels, that overall fan acceptance of them may start to change, may grow as the young become adults, and their voices get louder in the discussion. Their passion for the movies they grew up with drowns out some of the hatred that has likely become a simmer compared to the boiling rage it was 10 to 15 years prior when they first came out. But, and I see so many people trying to make this argument, saying that in time, The Last Jedi will be the next Empire Strikes Back, that it will be as beloved overall as that movie is, and trying to compare the reaction to that movie as a basis of your argument is anything from disingenuous to flat out flawed. Not only again do we honestly not know how people felt about Empire on the whole back in the day, but it seems hard to believe that so many people eventually changed their mind about that movie, and in such an extreme way. It's hard to think so many people didn't originally enjoy Empire or flat out hated it, similar to how they hate The Last Jedi, and did a complete 180 and now love it. And though yes, I fully expect the overall hatred to soften over time within the fanbase, as people just stop caring so much and the younger generation defend their trilogy, I highly doubt many who currently dislike it will actually come to love it in time. And most likely, as long as fans of the first two trilogies live, The Last Jedi will remain a huge point of contention within the fanbase. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. What will people say about The Last Jedi 40 years from now? And if you're old enough to remember, what was your initial impression of The Empire Strikes Back? And what did others you knew at the time seem to think of it? Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.